The car was already cold when someone noticed it, parked at the edge of the grass, half swallowed by morning fog, exactly where cars were never left. The engine was off. The doors were closed. Inside, two bodies sat unnaturally still, posed as if sleep had arrived too suddenly to resist. One of them leaned toward the other. Between them, metal caught the faint light. By the time anyone understood what they were looking at, whatever choice had been made inside that car was already irreversible. What unsettled people most wasn't just the violence, it was the location. The place had been designed to display control, over land, over spectacle, over excess. And yet here was something uncontrolled, sitting quietly in plain sight, as if it had always belonged there. A mistake left overnight, a silence that refused to explain itself. Later, some would insist the scene felt rehearsed. Others said it felt rushed. There were versions where the bodies were discovered exactly as the newspapers described, and other versions where small details shifted depending on who was telling the story. The angle of a head, the position of a hand, whether the fog was thinning or thickening when the first person arrived. But everyone agreed on one thing. By the time the car was found, the estate had already crossed a line it couldn't uncross. The damage didn't stop with the bodies, it spread outward. Whispers began before officials even arrived. Staff avoided certain paths. Guests stopped asking questions they didn't want answered. A place built to impress suddenly felt exposed, like a stage after the curtain dropped too early. People started noticing other things, how quiet the grounds felt afterward, how sounds carried differently, how areas that once drew attention were now passed without comment. Something had shifted, not visibly but permanently. Some claimed it was the first time the estate felt smaller than the stories told about. In the days that followed, explanations circulated, but none of them settled anything. One version suggested despair, another suggested betrayal, a third suggested something had been planned carefully, then improvised at the last possible moment. None of these versions ever gained full authority. They overlapped, contradicted, and survived side by side. What no one could explain was why the car had been allowed to sit there at all, why no one heard anything, why the place that hosted noise so confidently failed to notice the one sound that mattered. That question lingered longer than the investigation. As attention faded, the estate tried to resume its rhythm. Doors opened, lights were turned back on, schedules continued. But those who worked there spoke of a subtle repetition, small disruptions that echoed the original mistake. Objects misplaced, routines broken, a sense that the property was responding to something it hadn't been designed to contain. Visitors sensed it too, though they struggled to articulate what felt wrong. The scale was still overwhelming. The details were still immaculate. Yet something about the arrangement now felt excessive in the wrong direction, as if the space had outgrown its purpose and didn't know what to do with the extra room. Some claimed the event isolated nothing, that it merely revealed a pattern already in motion. Others insisted it was an intrusion, a singular rupture that contaminated everything afterward. The estate itself offered no opinion. It stood unchanged, absorbing interpretations without confirming any of them. What made the situation harder to dismiss was how quickly people stopped talking about the dead. The focus shifted instead to the property, to what it represented, to whether it could continue pretending nothing had happened there. Silence, it turned out, was easier to maintain than innocence. There was a detail that circulated quietly among those closest to the grounds, something minor, almost trivial. On the morning the car was found, one gate had been left open, not forced, not damaged, just open. No one remembered opening it. No one admitted responsibility. It became a footnote in some telling. In others, it became everything. That gate had been built to signal entry, to separate those allowed inside from those who weren't. And yet, on that morning, it had failed without protest. The estate didn't collapse. It didn't announce anything. It simply allowed something it was never meant to host, and then kept standing. Years later, people would argue about whether that moment mattered at all, whether the mistake was accidental or inevitable, whether the estate was already hollow by the time the car arrived, or whether the car hollowed it out. No version ever fully satisfied, because the problem wasn't just what happened inside the vehicle. It was that the place built to control appearances had no way to contain what came next. And once that became visible, even briefly, the estate could never return to being just a house again. No announcement was ever made. There was no public moment when the estate acknowledged what had happened. Instead, the response took the form of adjustments so small they could almost pass as coincidence. A pathway closed for maintenance longer than expected. A garden trimmed back more aggressively than usual. Certain rooms quietly removed from circulation without explanation. To outsiders, it looked like discretion. To those inside, it felt more like containment. Stories began to circulate among staff, never formally, never in full sentences. Someone would mention that a routine had changed, then stop speaking. Someone else would lower their voice when describing an area of the grounds, as if sound itself traveled differently there now. It wasn't fear exactly, it was caution without a clear object. The estate had always depended on choreography. Movement was intentional, appearances were managed, guests were guided toward spectacle and away from infrastructure. What the incident disrupted wasn't reputation, not immediately, but rhythm. The place missed a beat, then another. Some claimed the disruption revealed how much labor had been required to keep everything seamless. Once that labor hesitated, even briefly, inconsistencies surfaced. Deliveries arrived late. Repairs lingered unresolved. A fountain was left dry for weeks because no one could agree on who had authority to order its restoration. Each delay seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that resisted correction. There were rumors that certain areas were avoided, not out of superstition, but out of liability. Others insisted the opposite. That liability was the excuse, and something less practical was at work. No one ever produced documentation. There were no memos acknowledging fear, only schedules that quietly rearranged themselves. Visitors noticed the change without naming it. They still admired the scale, the symmetry, the excess, but the enthusiasm felt rehearsed, thinner than before. Compliments lingered too long, as if waiting for confirmation. Laughter arrived a moment late. It was said the estate began to feel performative in a way it hadn't before, like it was now aware of itself. One version that circulated among nearby residents suggested the grounds had always been unstable, just hidden by abundance, that the incident merely stripped away distraction long enough for flaws to register. Another version insisted the opposite, that something had entered the property and never left, altering how people behaved within its boundary. Neither version could be disproven, which allowed both to survive. What complicated matters further was how quickly the narrative shifted away from responsibility. Attention drifted toward interpretation instead. People debated symbolism. They speculated about inevitability. They discussed whether the estate represented aspiration or warning. The actual cost, human or otherwise, remained abstract. Maintenance logs from that period, where they exist at all, show an unusual number of revisions. Dates crossed out, instructions rewritten, tasks reassigned multiple times. No single error stood out. Instead, there was a sense of indecision baked into the paperwork itself. Some believed this reflected leadership uncertainty. Others believed it reflected something harder to define, a reluctance to impose order on a space that had already demonstrated how easily order could fail. There was also the matter of repetition. A gardener reportedly mentioned that he kept finding the same gate unlatched, even after securing it himself. Another worker insisted the lights in a particular wing behaved unpredictably, flickering without electrical cause. These stories were never escalated. They lived in conversation only, passed between people who didn't expect solutions. It wasn't that anyone thought the estate was unsafe. It was that safety had become negotiable. What no one could ignore was the growing contrast between investment and return. The estate demanded constant input, time, money, attention, but offered diminishing clarity in exchange. It no longer impressed effortlessly. It required explanation, justification, reassurance. And reassurance, once necessary, rarely convinces. At some point, no one could later agree when, the estate stopped being discussed as a home and started being discussed as a problem, not publicly, quietly, in conditional language. If this continues, unless something changes, as long as nothing else happens. Those conditions never resolved. They only stacked. There was an attempt, according to one account, to restore confidence through spectacle. A gathering planned larger than necessary, invitations extended beyond the usual circle, music arranged to fill every corner. The goal, some said, was to overwrite memory with noise. It worked, briefly, but afterward, the silence felt heavier than before. The grounds didn't decay, not yet. They remained impressive, intact, carefully managed. But the effort behind that management became visible, and once visible, impossible to ignore. The estate was no longer effortlessly dominant. It was defensive. The car was gone. The bodies were buried. Official conclusions had been reached, at least on paper, and yet the property behaved as though none of that mattered, because the problem, whatever it was, hadn't arrived suddenly. The incident had only made it observable, and once a flaw becomes observable, the structure holding it together must work harder than ever, pretend nothing has changed. Keeping the estate intact required more than money. It required vigilance, the kind that doesn't sleep well and rarely admits fatigue. After the incident, attention shifted from display to preservation, though no one used those words. The objective wasn't improvement, it was prevention. What needed preventing was never clearly defined. There were meetings that produced no minutes, conversations that ended without decision. The estate continued operating, but with an undercurrent of hesitation. Every action carried the weight of unintended consequence. Even maintenance felt provisional, as if restoring something too thoroughly might invite scrutiny rather than stability. One account described the property as over-maintained, flowers replaced too quickly, surfaces polished past necessity, repairs completed, then redone. The effect wasn't reassurance, it was suspicion. People began to ask what required such constant correction. The estate had always been expensive to run. That was understood, even admired. Excess was part of the design. But now the expense no longer translated into momentum. Resources were spent to hold position, not advance it. The property consumed effort without producing certainty. Those closest to its operation sensed this imbalance first. They spoke of exhaustion without labor, of days spent responding to problems that couldn't be named in reports. When asked what needed fixing, answers stayed vague. Atmosphere, flow, public confidence. None of those fit neatly into budgets. Outside, perceptions shifted slowly. The estate remained impressive, but its relevance softened. Invitations declined, appearances shortened. Guests arrived late and left early. The place no longer anchored attention, it competed for it. Some argued this was inevitable, that the era which rewarded such displays had already begun to fade. Others insisted the estate had accelerated its own obsolescence by refusing to acknowledge change. Neither argument gained dominance. They existed simultaneously, reinforcing indecision. There was also the matter of scale. The estate was too large to retreat quietly, but too specific to adapt easily. It could not become modest without betraying its purpose. It could not become louder without inviting ridicule. It existed in a narrow corridor of acceptability that grew tighter each year. Attempts to redefine its role were floated, then abandoned, hosting more events, limiting access, expanding operations beyond the property. Each proposal stalled under scrutiny. The question no one asked directly was whether the estate itself had become the liability. That question hovered unspoken. Maintenance issues multiplied, not catastrophically, but persistently. A leak that returned after repair. Grounds that demanded more labor for diminishing visual return. Infrastructure designed for spectacle struggling under the weight of routine use. These weren't failures, they were reminders. The estate had been built for moment, not longevity. Some believed the incident had simply accelerated a reckoning that would have arrived regardless. Others believed it fractured trust in a way no restoration could address. The lack of consensus ensured paralysis. Meanwhile, costs continued, not just financial but psychological. Decisions deferred became burdens themselves. Responsibility blurred. Authority thinned. People avoided ownership of outcomes, preferring processes that distributed blame without resolving anything. At some point, the estate stopped being aspirational even to those tasked with maintaining it. It became something to endure. Visitors sensed this, though they rarely articulated it. They described the place as impressive but heavy, as if the weight of its past crowded the present, as if enjoyment required justification. The irony was difficult to ignore. The more effort expended to preserve the estate's image, the more artificial that image felt. Authenticity, once assumed, now had to be argued into existence. And arguments rarely convince without resistance. One detail resurfaced repeatedly in later recollections. A comment made by someone who worked the grounds daily, spoken casually, and later repeated with emphasis. It feels like the house is waiting for something. No one asked what. Waiting implies anticipation. Anticipation implies unfinished business. Whether that was true or merely metaphor depended on who was telling the story. But the phrase endured because it captured the mood precisely, a structure suspended between what it had been and what it could no longer convincingly become. The estate did not collapse under this tension. It persisted. But persistence is not the same as success. What had once been effortless now required justification. What had once dominated now negotiated. And what had once been admired without question now carried an invisible surcharge, the expectation of explanation. The incident had not destroyed the estate. It had made its survival expensive in ways no ledger could fully record. And as long as the cost continued to rise without a clear return, the question remained unresolved. How long could something built to impress afford to exist once it began needing to explain itself? At first, the changes were described as temporary, seasonal adjustment, transitional phase, words that implied motion without committing to direction. But over time, even those euphemisms wore thin. The estate wasn't transitioning, stalling. What made the stagnation difficult to confront was how well the structure resisted obvious failure. Roof lines held. Facades remained imposing. The grounds, though demanding, still responded to effort. From a distance, nothing appeared wrong. That distance became essential. Up close, however, the estate revealed a different truth, one defined less by decay than by inflexibility. Systems designed for peak moments struggled under continuous use. Spaces meant to impress briefly were never intended to function daily without consequence. Corridors built for flow became bottlenecked. Rooms sized for spectacle resisted subdivision. Every attempt to repurpose revealed how narrowly the original vision had been drawn. Some accounts describe this period as one of quiet frustration, not dramatic decline, but cumulative irritation, the kind that erodes confidence not through shock, but through repetition. Every workaround created a new problem. Every solution exposed another constraint. The estate no longer adapted. It demanded adaptation from everyone else. There were discussions, always provisional, about redefining its role. Could it become institutional? Could it serve a broader purpose? Could its scale justify itself through utility rather than display? Each question stalled under the same obstacle. The building refused to cooperate. Not literally, of course, but functionally. Walls stood where they shouldn't. Layouts resisted efficiency. Modifications introduced contradictions. It was as if the structure had been optimized for a single, fading context, and could not survive outside it without surrendering coherence. Some argued that this resistance was the estate's defining strength, proof of its integrity. Others saw it as evidence of short-sightedness masquerading as confidence. The disagreement ensured inertia. What complicated matters further was the estate's growing symbolic weight. It was no longer just a property. It had become a reference point, a cautionary example, a subject of conversation framed less around admiration and more around speculation. People began to ask what it meant that the building still stood, not whether it should, but why it continued to exist without a clear function. That question carried an implicit accusation: survival without purpose. Inside, morale shifted. Those responsible for maintaining operations began treating the estate as something to manage rather than believe in. Pride gave way to obligation. Initiative gave way to procedure. Procedure kept things running. It did not make them matter. One version that circulated among observers suggested the estate had outlived its audience, that it had been constructed for a world that no longer recognized its language. Another version suggested the estate had never been about audience at all, that it was inward-facing from the start, a private assertion misread as public offering. Both interpretations found evidence. Neither resolved the tension. What became increasingly clear was that the estate's scale now worked against it. Downsizing was impractical. Expansion was unjustifiable. Reinvention required compromise. The structure resisted at every turn. Even silence became expensive. Unused rooms demanded upkeep. Vacant spaces still aged. Absence did not halt entropy. It redistributed it. There were moments when decisive action seemed imminent. A proposal advanced far enough to generate anticipation. Contractors consulted. Assessments conducted. Then momentum collapsed under scrutiny. The risks outweighed the benefit. The cost of change rivaled the cost of stasis. Stasis, at least, was familiar. Observers later described this phase as the point when the estate ceased being dynamic. It still changed, but passively. External pressures shaped it more than internal vision. It reacted rather than asserted. What it reacted to most strongly was time. Cultural expectations shifted. Displays once read as ambition now read as excess. Grandeur once interpreted as confidence now suggested insulation. The estate's language grew increasingly out of step with its surrounding. Attempts to modernize clashed with original intent. Attempts to preserve clashed with practicality. Each effort satisfied one requirement at the expense of another. The structure did not fail. It endured. But endurance without alignment produced friction. And friction, sustained long enough, generates heat. That heat manifested as debate, hesitation, and quiet retreat. Decisions were delayed until they became irrelevant. Opportunities passed unclaimed because no one could agree on what success would look like. The estate had not been designed for negotiation. It had been designed for declaration. And once declarations lose their audience, they risk becoming monologue, impressive, echoing, and ultimately unanswered. By the time this became apparent, reversing course was no longer an option. Too much effort had been invested in maintaining an idea that no longer held consensus. Too many compromises had diluted clarity. The structure still stood, but it no longer led. And once a place built to dominate begins waiting for instruction, the balance shifts permanently, not toward collapse, but toward something quieter, heavier, and far harder to correct. The estate did not empty all at once. It thinned. Rooms went dark not because they were abandoned, but because no one could justify turning the lights on. Hallways remained intact, yet unused, preserved more by neglect than intention. The structure learned a new rhythm. Longer pauses, fewer peaks, extended silence between moments of relevance. What surprised observers wasn't that the estate declined. It was that it didn't collapse. There were periods when it seemed on the verge of resolution. Not redemption, resolution. A sale, a transfer, a decisive end that would allow the structure to become something else. Each time, negotiations faltered. Price, responsibility, reputation. The obstacles varied, but the outcome remained the same. The estate stayed. Its continued existence became an anomaly, too prominent to ignore, too cumbersome to embrace. It hovered between categories, belonging fully to none of them. This ambiguity made it strangely resilient. No single authority claimed it. No single narrative explained it. Over time, the absence of clarity became its defining feature. Those who passed by began to refer to it in the past tense, even while it stood unchanged. What it used to be, what it once meant. The present tense felt inappropriate, as if acknowledging current existence required justification. Inside, the structure accumulated layers without cohesion. Adjustments made for one purpose remained after that purpose disappeared. Temporary solutions became permanent by default. The estate was no longer curated. It was aggregated. This aggregation produced a particular atmosphere. Not decay, exactly, more like compression. Too many intentions occupying the same space without hierarchy. The building carried traces of ambition, retreat, adaptation, and denial all at once. Some believed this complexity made the estate more interesting than it had ever been. Others believed it made it incoherent. The disagreement kept it suspended. There were accounts of people exploring parts of the structure that had been forgotten even by those responsible for oversight. Rooms containing furniture arranged for functions no one remembered. Equipment maintained long past relevance. Signage that referenced systems no longer in use. None of this was dramatic. That was the point. The estate's refusal to die was quiet, persistent, unremarkable in isolation. It survived not through strength, but through friction. Every attempt to remove it encountered enough resistance to stall, but not enough to justify confrontation. Time passed unevenly. Years slipped by without event. Then a brief surge of attention would arrive, a proposal, a rumor, a moment of relevance, only to dissipate again. The estate became accustomed to this pattern. Its most significant transformation during this period was psychological. It shifted from object to subject. People stopped asking what it was and started asking what it represented. Representation is dangerous for structures. It invites projection. Some saw the estate as evidence of waste, others as proof of endurance. Some framed it as a cautionary tale, others as an opportunity waiting to be recognized. Each interpretation said more about the observer than the building itself. The structure absorbed them all. One version that circulated among preservationists suggested the estate survived because no one wanted to be responsible for its end. Demolition implied admission of failure. Repurposing implied concession. Leaving it untouched allowed everyone to defer judgment. Deferred judgment has a way of extending timelines indefinitely. There were moments when neglect edged close to collapse, water intrusion, structural stress, systems nearing irreversibility. Each time, intervention arrived just in time. Not enough to revive, but enough to stabilize. Stabilization became the goal. The estate's continued presence altered its surroundings subtly. Development adjusted around it. Infrastructure accounted for it. Its refusal to resolve created a fixed point in a shifting landscape. People who encountered it during this phase often described conflicting impressions: awe mixed with discomfort, curiosity tempered by uncertainty. The structure no longer invited admiration. It demanded interpretation. That demand exhausted many. Yet the estate persisted, not because it adapted successfully, but because it adapted insufficiently to fail outright. It occupied a narrow band between relevance and redundancy, protected by indecision. Those who studied its history later struggled to define when decline became stasis. There was no clear threshold, no moment of collapse, just a gradual acceptance that the estate existed without intention. And intention, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. What remained undeniable was that the estate had outlived its original purpose by decades. Whatever justification once animated its creation no longer applied. The structure had become a container for aftermath rather than ambition. Still, it stood. Walls held. Foundations endured. The silhouette remained unmistakable. The estate refused the dignity of disappearance and the clarity of renewal. It simply continued, and in continuing, it accumulated a different kind of weight. Not the weight of excess or spectacle, but the weight of unresolved existence, a presence that demanded acknowledgement without offering explanation. By refusing to die, the estate forced a different question into circulation. Not whether it should be saved, not whether it should be erased, but why it had been allowed to linger long enough to become something no one had planned for. A structure defined not by what it was, but by what it had survived. At some point, the estate's survival stopped being admirable. It became uncomfortable. What had once been described as endurance began to look more like avoidance. The structure remained not because it was needed, but because no one could agree on what replacing it would signify. Every option carried implications larger than the building itself. Saving it implied belief. Removing it implied judgment. And judgment, once rendered, cannot be undone. By this stage, the estate's identity was almost entirely retrospective. Conversations about it leaned heavily on memory, not personal memory, but inherited recollection. People spoke of what others had said it once was. The building existed less as a place than as a citation. This created a peculiar distortion. Decisions were no longer evaluated based on present conditions, but on hypothetical reactions to past meanings. The estate was protected not by usefulness, but by interpretation. Those responsible for its oversight found themselves managing expectation rather than structure. Any action risked offending one narrative or validating another. Neutrality became the safest position, and neutrality, applied long enough, becomes policy. Meanwhile, the physical reality continued asserting itself. Materials aged. Systems failed more frequently. Maintenance crossed from preservation into triage. Each repair bought time, but reduced flexibility. The structure could be stabilized, but not easily transformed. Transformation would require admitting that the estate, as originally conceived, had failed to remain relevant. That admission remained elusive. One explanation that circulated quietly suggested the estate's greatest flaw was not excess, but finality. It had been built as a conclusion, a statement meant to stand unchanged. Conclusions age poorly when treated as foundation. The world around it adapted. The estate resisted. This resistance was often misread as dignity. But dignity depends on context, and context had shifted. Grandeur without alignment risks becoming obstruction. Attempts to reframe the estate as heritage gained traction briefly. Preservation language offered moral cover for inaction. Protecting history sounded noble. But preservation raised uncomfortable questions. Which version of history deserved protection, and why this one? Those questions fractured consensus. Some argued the estate represented craftsmanship worth saving. Others countered that craftsmanship alone did not justify scale. Some framed it as cultural artifact, others as indulgent relic. Each position produced a stalemate. While debates continued, the building's needs grew more urgent. Deferred decisions compounded. Every year of survival increased the cost of eventual action, whether restoration or removal. Survival, paradoxically, raised the stakes against itself. People who encountered the estate during this period often reported a sense of suspension. The place felt paused, not abandoned, but waiting. Waiting for permission, waiting for absolution, waiting for relevance. This waiting was contagious. Projects stalled nearby. Development bent around the structure rather than confronting it. The estate exerted gravity without offering direction. One account described it as a question mark made of stone. That metaphor endured because it captured the tension precisely. The building no longer asserted meaning. It demanded response. Inside, the accumulation of eras became more visible. Layers overlapped without integration. The estate no longer told a story. It archived argument. Each modification contradicted the last. Nothing fully replaced anything else. This made the structure difficult to navigate conceptually, not just physically. No single intention dominated. No guiding logic emerged. The estate became its own record of indecision. There were moments when clarity seemed possible, when a proposal aligned just enough interests to move forward. Each time, hesitation reappeared at the final stage. Someone asked what precedent would be set. Someone else questioned what message would be sent. Messages mattered more than outcomes. The estate survived another year, then another. What no one acknowledged openly was that survival itself had become the problem. As long as the building remained unresolved, it continued generating debate, expense, and unease. Its presence consumed attention disproportionate to its function. But ending that presence required a consensus no one could reach. The estate had outlasted its builders, its era, and its initial critics. Now, it outlasted solutions. It existed in a liminal state, not alive in purpose, not dead in fact. This liminality became its defining condition. Those who advocated for decisive action found themselves accused of impatience. Those who defended preservation were accused of sentimentality. Neither side prevailed. The estate remained, and with each passing year the question sharpened. Was the building being preserved for what it was, or because confronting its meaning felt riskier than leaving it unresolved? No answer gained authority. The structure stood, not as triumph or ruin, but as unresolved sentence, grammatically complete, semantically suspended. It had survived long enough to demand explanation, but too long to accept a simple one. And in that refusal to resolve, it revealed something uncomfortable, that structures built to declare permanence often struggle most when permanence is no longer admired. Survival, stripped of purpose, becomes inertia, and inertia, sustained long enough, turns into its own kind of decay. By the time anyone dared to name the problem, it was already too late for naming to matter. The estate had survived every phase that should have ended: scandal, obsolescence, neglect, debate. It absorbed them all without collapsing. And that endurance, once mistaken for strength, revealed itself as something else entirely: accumulation. What the structure carried wasn't just age or history, but unresolved intention. Each era had left something behind, not enough to redefine the place, but enough to complicate. The result wasn't continuity, it was congestion. One version that gained quiet traction suggested the estate had never been meant to adapt, that its greatest flaw was not excess, but certainty. It had been conceived as a final answer in a world that never stops asking new questions. If that version was true, then the car found years earlier wasn't an interruption. It was an exposure, a moment when control failed long enough to reveal how fragile the idea of permanence really was. Another interpretation insisted the opposite, that the estate was always meant to evolve, but was denied that chance by the weight of its own symbolism. Every attempt at change was treated as betrayal, every deviation as loss. Preservation froze what should have been allowed to transform. Both explanations circulated. Neither closed the case. What could no longer be denied was the pattern. The estate didn't decline because it was attacked. It stalled because it was protected. Shielded from decisive action by competing loyalties, it remained intact long enough for relevance to evaporate. This wasn't unique to the building. It echoed a broader logic from the era that produced it, a belief that accumulation itself guaranteed meaning, that scale could substitute for flexibility, that enough resources could overcome structural miscalculation. The estate proved otherwise. By surviving everything, it became the record of everything that went unresolved. Each postponed decision hardened into architecture. Each avoided conclusion embedded itself in layout, maintenance, and reputation. Those who finally articulated this did so carefully, conditionally. If this version holds, they would say, if the pattern is real. No one wanted certainty. Certainty had already caused enough damage. Seen this way, the estate wasn't a failure of ambition. It was a failure of timing. Built to declare arrival, it mistook arrival for permanence. It treated success as a state rather than a phase. And phases end whether acknowledged or not. The car, the silence afterward, the years of hesitation, none of these created the problem. They revealed it. The estate had no mechanism for reversal, no graceful way to contract, no language for retreat. Expansion was possible. Preservation was possible. Adaptation was not. That was the cost hidden beneath the spectacle. In its final unresolved state, the estate became something its creators never intended: a case study, not in excess, but in rigidity, not in decay, but in endurance without alignment. It stood as proof that structures designed to impress indefinitely often struggle most when admiration changes shape. Even now, versions of the story continue to circulate. Some frame the estate as a victim of changing values, others as a monument to misplaced confidence. Some still search for redemption in restoration. Others see restoration itself as another delay. None of these versions fully settle. Because the truth, or at least one version that refuses to disappear, is quieter than any of them. The estate didn't fail spectacularly. It succeeded too completely at the wrong thing. It did exactly what it was built to do: endure as a declaration. What it couldn't do was stop declaring once no one was listening, and so it remained. Not empty exactly, not alive in purpose, a structure that outlasted its moment and now exists as aftermath rather than intention. If this interpretation holds, then the estate was never meant to be reused, redeemed, or erased. It was meant to stand just long enough for the cost of certainty to become visible, not as ruin, as residue. The car at the edge of the grounds wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the first moment when the illusion of control failed publicly enough to be noticed. Everything after was continuation. The estate still stands because no one has fully decided what it means to let it stop. And until that decision is made, or avoided long enough to become irrelevant, it will remain what it has been for decades now. A monument not to wealth or ambition, but to the difficulty of ending things built as conclusion. If that is the lesson, then it arrives too late to correct the structure itself, but not too late to recognize the pattern elsewhere.